Hello, government students. Today we're going to talk about the election process, and I'm starting off with this picture here showing two elderly ladies voting. And I use this picture on purpose because in America, unfortunately, it is the elderly who tend to vote the most. And unfortunately, it is the young voters from 18 to 29 years of age who vote the least. And if you want your issues to be heard by the politicians in Washington or Springfield or wherever, it's important that you vote. Politicians listen to those who vote much more than those who do not vote. So make sure when an election comes around, you get to the polls and cast your vote. Having said that, let's get started. I'm going to move pretty quick, so if you need to pause to get notes down, please do. I am going to move quickly so we don't run out of time. But let's take a look at who can vote in America and how that has evolved in our nation's history. It is the states who determine who could vote in the early years, and in the very earliest years of our nation, it was only white male property holders who could vote. By the mid-1800s, all white adult males were able to vote. It wasn't just property holders. Next up came the 15th Amendment after the Civil War, which opened up the voting to African American males. Basically, it said that you can't be denied your right to vote due to race. However, a lot of states in the South and elsewhere came up with some creative rules about voting, which, while not officially targeting African Americans, the practical effect was that it kept African Americans from being able to vote. We'll get into those restrictions in a later lesson. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, the various states were starting to allow women to vote, and then in 1920, the 19th Amendment was passed, which gave the right to vote to all women all across the country, as long as they were adults. You couldn't deny women the right to vote based on their gender. 1964 was the next big change with the Voting Rights Act of 1964, which outlawed those voting restrictions on African Americans that had been put into place in many states after the 15th Amendment. Now, African Americans did not have these limitations, and since 1964, there's been a much higher participation rate of African Americans in the voting process. And the last big change happened in 1971 with the passage of the 26th Amendment, and that lowered the voting age to 18 years old. It had been 21 before, and that was largely the result of the Vietnam War, when a lot of people 18 and 20 years old were fighting in the Vietnam War, and yet they weren't able to have their voice heard in the election process, and that war, of course, was quite unpopular. Okay, let's do a few definitions. First of all, a normal election is where you have congressional elections that are focused on local issues. And typically these will result in a pretty small shift in the power of the parties in Congress of the United States. But there are also nationalized elections, and in nationalized elections, it is national issues that dominate even a local congressional election. And so oftentimes these nationalized elections result in a large shift between the political parties that are represented in Congress. Most of the time, normal elections would be the most common. That's why it's called a normal election. However, there are frequently nationalized elections, and I would say that the election of 2018 was a nationalized election, and I'm guessing the election of 2022 will be a nationalized election. It seems that nationalized elections are becoming more and more common, and I think that's probably the result of social media and how social media can have these national issues, have a spotlight shined on them so that people are very much aware of the national issues and they get fired up to vote. A few more definitions. The incumbent in an election, the incumbent is the person who is currently in office. And then the person who wants to unseat the incumbent is called the challenger. Okay, so in the last presidential election, Donald Trump was the incumbent, Joe Biden was the challenger. Assuming Joe Biden runs for re-election in 2024, he will now be the incumbent, and whoever runs against him, the challenger. Sometimes you don't have an incumbent. Sometimes whoever holds the seat in Congress or the seat of the presidency will choose not to run, retire, or whatever. In that case, you have what's called an open seat, and so you do not have an incumbent, and those tend to be much more competitive elections oftentimes. Let's talk about the nomination process. First of all, each state will select delegates that will choose who a party will nominate for office. And here I'm really focusing on presidential elections. So each state picks who that state will vote for in nominating the candidate. There's a couple of ways states do this. First off is the caucus. Not all states have caucuses, but about 10 or so do. In a caucus, voters will meet on caucus night in a great big room somewhere, usually 1 or 2 big rooms per county. It might be more, but they'll meet in a big room and they'll hear candidates speak or a spokesperson for the candidate speak, and then all the people in that caucus room will vote on their preferred candidate at the end of the meeting. Whoever wins the caucus vote will be the nominee for that state. If there's no majority, the caucus can go a long time because most caucuses will require a majority vote. So if 10 candidates are running for the nomination, you might have to keep weeding out candidates over and over again before you can get to a majority. And again, those caucuses can go as long as 4 hours, sometimes even longer, before finally someone gets the majority. Most states now use primaries. A primary is an election that's held where the voters get to choose who they want to be a party's candidate. They don't have to go to a big room like at the caucus. They just go to wherever they would normally vote. And it's a private little election, a private little vote that you get to cast for your preferred candidate within a political party. There are 2 types of primaries. A closed primary is where you have to be a registered member of a political party to vote in that party's primary. If you aren't a registered member, you might be able to show up at the primary and then while you are there declare membership and register for that party, and then you go and cast your vote for who you want to be the candidate for that political party. There are also open primaries, and in open primaries, voters can get ballots with candidates for each party, or you might have to request a specific political party's ballot, and you would just get to vote for the candidates in one political party. Most states who have open primaries have the second type, where you would vote for a specific political party candidate. You would not be able to vote for candidates for both parties, but there are a few states who allow you to vote for candidates for both. Illinois uses the second type of open primary, where voters request a specific party ballot when they show up to vote in the primary. If you ask for the Democratic Party primary, you get to pick Democratic Party candidates. You do not get to pick candidates for the Republican Party in that case. A few states require a majority to win in a primary, and in those states you could conceivably have a runoff primary if there's 5 or 6 candidates running for to be candidates for a particular race. You have to get a majority. You might have to have a runoff with the top 2 vote getters. Most states do not have that, though. Illinois does not have runoff primaries. It's just whoever gets the most votes, a plurality. You don't have to have a majority in Illinois. Let's look at some pros and cons of primaries. There's good and bad dealing with primaries. As I said, most states have primaries, and here's what's good about them. Primaries are more democratic than the way it used to be done, and there's less corruption. Back before we had primaries, you would have situations where the political bigwigs, the bosses of the political parties would get together in a little room, and they would pick the candidates for their party. They used to call them a smoke-filled room. Picture a bunch of old men smoking cigars, picking their candidates for office. And what would happen, sometimes a guy would say, hey, I'll support your candidate for presidency, but you got to do something for me in return. It could lend to corruption. So there's less corruption in primaries. You don't have that going on, and they're more democratic. All the people have a say in who's going to be chosen to be a candidate. But there are some bad things about primaries. You have a very low voter turnout. And by low, I mean as low as 10-15% of the people show up to vote in primaries. It's a very low turnout. They're very expensive. Lots of money spent on these primaries. They're divisive. Think about this. Think about the last presidential election. You had Joe Biden running against Bernie Sanders. Well, some of those Bernie Sanders voters may not have been very excited to have to now go vote for Biden after he won the Democratic primary. Same before with when there were several Republicans and ultimately Trump got the nomination. Some of those Republicans just couldn't stomach voting for Trump either. So primaries can be quite divisive. Primaries favor candidates with the best name recognition or the most wealth, and we can certainly see that with Donald Trump winning. There were a lot of candidates running for that election, but it went to the one with the most name recognition, the most wealth, and that's happened at the state level too. We've had very wealthy people winning the primary elections to become candidates for governor in Illinois. And finally, non-party members can rate a primary. There's nothing that says you have to fit, in an open primary, you don't have to be a Democrat to vote in the Democratic primary. So Republicans might choose to vote in the Democratic Party's primary, and they might pick a candidate that they think would be the weaker of the candidates. I think that's happened quite often. I think it happened a lot in 2016. I think a lot of people thought Trump would be a weak candidate, and I have a feeling some Democrats went and voted for Trump in that primary thinking he would be weak. Of course, it turns out he was anything but weak, and he won the election. Okay, next step is the convention. After we've had the caucuses or primaries, we have the convention. It is the caucuses and primaries who determine who will run for Congress, state offices, as well as the presidency. And then those caucuses and primaries will determine who each state will support for president at the party's national convention. So if Joe Biden wins the Democratic primary in Illinois, then Illinois' delegates at the convention will all vote for Biden to be the nominee. Some states do use winner-take-all primaries, and I believe Illinois is one of those. If Biden gets more votes than anyone else, he is the winner of the primary. Some states will use proportional allocation, where maybe Biden would get 60% of the votes and Bernie Sanders would get 40%. In that case, a state that has proportional allocation would give 60% of their delegates to Biden and 40% to Bernie Sanders. Again, I'm pretty sure that Illinois is a winner-take-all. Now let's look at the election itself. The goal is to have free, honest, and accurate elections. State and local governments have the most control over the process. Holding elections, the process of the elections, is a reserved power of the states. Remember that. The federal government has just a minimum amount of involvement in elections. They determine when general elections are held. The federal government requires secret ballots. And then the Voting Rights Act of 1964, which we already discussed, did away with those restrictions that were intended to keep minorities, especially African Americans, from being able to vote. But those are really the only way that the federal government gets involved in elections. Otherwise, it's all state controlled. Here's some ballots. States determine the type of ballots that are used. And most ballots will either be optical scan, punch card, or touch screen. Here's an optical scan ballot. You just take a pen of some sort and you fill in the little bubble, and that's how you place your vote. And then you take your optical scan ballot, and the person who did the voting typically feeds it into the machine himself, and your vote is then registered. Punch card ballots are they've kind of been phased out, but they used to be very common. You take a stylus over here and you slide your card into this slot, and then you see the little holes, and you punch the appropriate hole to pick your candidate. That's a punch card ballot. There are also e-voting machines that use the same technology as a bank ATM machine. Now, there are some concerns about these ballots. Hanging chads, that happens on punch card ballots, where you punch the card, but the paper doesn't come all the way out, and voting machines will have trouble reading those sometimes. Butterfly ballot confusion. Look at this. This is a butterfly ballot. You have candidates on either side. You vote down the middle. They can be confusing. So, for example, if I wanted to vote for Al Gore, I see that he's the second one here. I might punch the second hole. In that case, I just voted for Pat Buchanan. So those can be confusing, especially to elderly people who maybe don't have great eyesight. And then e-voting machines have had some issues. The law doesn't automatically require an audit or a recount on these machines. There's no random samplings, and as you probably know, there have been accusations by losing candidates that say these e-voting machines were partisan. And with that, I'm going to close this presentation. We'll talk about these things more.